Ilhan Omar strode into the chamber, utterly convinced she was about to deliver a fatal political execution, entirely unaware that Donald Trump was waiting to dismantle her legacy with a single, devastating financial receipt. Ilhan Omar had scarcely finished branding the President of the United States a six-time financial failure when the room exploded with applause, cheering as if they had been holding their breath all evening for the green light to celebrate. She offered a triumphant smile, proposed that the nation should deport the man who had squandered its wealth, and absorbed the adoration of 10 million viewers witnessing the jab in real time. Her loyalists leaped to their feet. Smartphones were hoisted to record. Digital snippets were instantly clipped for social media, and within mere moments, the confrontation was universally heralded as the most flawless political strike Omar had executed in years. Her inner circle was convinced their strategy was a resounding success. The juxtaposition was elegantly simple, deeply emotional, and perfectly engineered to portray her as the resilient refugee who had intellectually dwarfed the billionaire who had previously ridiculed her. For a span of 90 seconds, the entire atmosphere of that congressional room was the sole property of Ilhan Omar, and she projected the aura of a leader, fully confident that her viral moment had already permanently infected the national dialogue. The physical environment had been meticulously orchestrated to maximize this specific visual impact, featuring an overwhelming presence of camera lenses, an excess of political journalists, and that distinct, crackling tension that materializes whenever the Capitol anticipates a brutal confrontation. Omar maintained a rigid, upright posture, adorned in a deep burgundy hijab paired with a sharp navy blazer. Her hands were neatly clasped, her briefing folders were geometrically aligned, and absolutely every peripheral detail was tightly regulated, because she understood profoundly that her physical demeanor would be scrutinized alongside every morning headline. Her introductory remarks swept dramatically through her history in a refugee camp, the agonizing years of waiting, the vulnerable child arriving on foreign soil without speaking the language, and the chorus of men who had perpetually insisted she had no place in halls of power. She strategically referenced the infamous 2019 political rally and its aggressive chants, deliberately casting Trump as the ultimate aggressor before weaponizing that very history against his record. She subsequently drew a sharp contrast between her ascent from absolute obscurity and his reliance on inherited wealth and corporate bankruptcies, challenging the public to evaluate which of the two had genuinely earned their position. Trump, remarkably, did not leap to his own defense. He did not interrupt her monologue, nor did he manifest the deeply wounded countenance that the Washington establishment had eagerly anticipated. Furthermore, he completely bypassed the artificial, frozen grin that seasoned politicians typically deploy when they desperately want the media to believe an insult failed to penetrate their armor. Instead, he released a genuine, open laugh, throwing his head backward as his shoulders shook and his eyes narrowed in amusement. Instantly, the carefully curated rhythm that Omar's communications team had so painstakingly rehearsed evaporated from the room. That singular laugh was a strategic masterstroke. Expressing anger would have merely validated her dominance in the exchange. Issuing a denial would have unnecessarily prolonged her chosen narrative, and exhibiting defensiveness would have anchored her specific insults at the very core of the debate. His laughter achieved the exact opposite effect, significantly diminishing the magnitude of her attack and seamlessly transforming her meticulously crafted offensive blow into a convenient setup for the counter-ambush he was actively preparing. The surrounding applause noticeably faded. The aura of absolute certainty vanished, and Omar's media handlers were abruptly confronted with the one singular reaction their war room had never simulated. Maintaining a broad grin, Trump leaned deliberately toward his microphone and echoed, "6 bankruptcies." As she silently tallied the score, he remarked, "I'm flattered." Usually people only count to 4, allowing the gallery ample time to process the humor before drastically shifting the conversational axis. He calmly stated that he possessed zero interest in litigating his past corporate insolvencies. He explained that he had effectively transmuted those early stumbles into towering skyscrapers, lucrative negotiations, a television empire, and a political juggernaut formidable enough to place him in that exact chair. Rather, he expressed an intense desire to dissect her specific numbers. He introduced a figure far more lethal than any passing joke, primarily because it was entirely disconnected from standard corporate lore, sensationalist tabloids, or dusty political grievances. The number in question was a staggering $250 million, and he strategically unveiled it as the beating heart of a massive operational collapse intimately tied to a piece of legislation boasting a title virtually no elected official could safely oppose. The confident smile resting on Omar's face grew noticeably rigid, signaling that she recognized long before the general public caught on that the trajectory of the hearing was rapidly migrating away from emotional biography and plunging directly into cold, hard documentation. Raising a single printed sheet into the air, Trump explained how the Meals Act had been deliberately shrouded in rhetorical armor. It utilized legislative phrasing that no politician could challenge without instantly appearing deeply cruel, exploiting the universal reality that nobody wishes to be branded as an opponent of feeding impoverished children. He thoroughly highlighted the fact that this specific measure had glided through with robust bipartisan backing, heavily insulated by the moral force of a name specifically engineered to suffocate any potential skepticism before it could even begin. Following this exposition, he abruptly distilled the entire narrative down to raw arithmetic. The solitary language that the Washington apparatus remains entirely incapable of smothering with compelling personal histories, emotional framing, or managed outrage. An astonishing $250 million had flowed unhindered through an initiative fundamentally established to provide sustenance to minors. And yet, this monumental sum of capital had completely failed to yield the specific humanitarian outcomes the public had been promised. What Omar had so eloquently packaged as a triumph of compassion, Trump was now ruthlessly dismantling as an unregulated financial pipeline. The chasm between these two contrasting descriptions rapidly consumed the oxygen in the chamber. He mockingly equated the vanished funds to an extravagant magical illusion, sarcastically crowning it a feat superior to David Copperfield, noting only one critical distinction because Copperfield eventually brings things back. And this money had simply disappeared. The line drew genuine laughter from the neutral sections of the audience. Members of the press corps rose from their seats, and notably, several attendees who had enthusiastically cheered for Omar mere minutes prior were now chuckling, rendering the moment more damaging than partisan applause. The fact that the crowd laughed prior to consciously evaluating whether they accepted the accusation allowed Trump to make the claim feel obvious before it had been debated. Omar's left hand drifted hesitantly toward a closed folder resting on her desk, reacting instinctively as if a document hidden inside might reverse the room, but the folder remained closed, and the gesture ended before becoming a rebuttal in a chamber packed with cameras. That unfinished movement looked like the first visible sign that she had not expected the numbers. Taking advantage of the pause, Trump inquired about the exact quantity of meals that had genuinely been served with the money, paused long enough to make the audience answer silently, and hinted that the figure was perfectly round. He said the answer was zero, not a disappointing fraction, not bureaucratic underperformance, but 0 meals delivered for $250 million spent. The room instantaneously ceased its laughter. The gravity of that solitary figure changed the exchange from entertainment into accusation and forced everyone to confront the scale of the alleged failure. He followed with the prosecution totals, saying 79 people had been indicted, 56 had pleaded guilty, and 89% of those prosecuted were Somali. Those numbers struck directly at the identity Omar had used as protection because the program had supposedly existed to serve her community while the prosecution centered on people from that same community. The supporters seated behind Omar did not become Trump voters. and they did not need to because the damage came from doubt rather than conversion. A woman in a blue hijab shifted in her seat with the restrained discomfort of someone hearing information she had not expected from the man she had expected to oppose. Trump framed the matter as a betrayal committed in the name of children, money collected under the banner of mercy, and then swallowed by a system that rewarded connections instead of feeding families. He turned the next page and introduced Safari Restaurant, a business Omar had publicly praised in Somali, for allegedly serving thousands of meals each day. Then, he said, prosecutors concluded the restaurant had served 0 meals, leaving Omar's opening triumph buried beneath the first wave of figures she had never expected to answer. The Safari Restaurant was not a side note, not an isolated vendor, and not a minor accounting irregularity that could be buried beneath the usual fog of administrative language. Trump identified it as the largest fraud site in the network and reminded the room that Omar had praised it publicly in Somali for supposedly serving 2,300 meals a day. The significance was not merely that the meals were never served, but that the praise had helped give credibility to an operation prosecutors later described as empty. Trump emphasized that 0 children had been fed while money moved into luxury cars, real estate, and overseas transfers, making the public celebration look less like community advocacy and more like cover. The room understood the problem immediately because once a politician personally validates a program that later collapses under criminal prosecutions, distance becomes much harder to manufacture. At this precise juncture, Trump introduced the Treasury Department, and the atmosphere changed because Treasury tracing meant the story no longer ended with fraudulent invoices inside Minnesota. It meant federal investigators were following funds across borders, examining accounts, transfers, destinations, and the financial architecture used after the money left the original program. Omar's jaw tightened, a movement small enough to escape a casual observer but visible to every camera trained on the witness table. Her composure remained technically intact, yet the confidence that had defined her opening was gone because confidence depends on knowing which questions are coming. She had prepared to fight accusations of racism, xenophobia, and political targeting. But she had not prepared to answer a trail of money moving beyond the country. Omar reached for the defense that had protected her through years of political combat, arguing that the scrutiny was part of a campaign targeting Muslims and Somali Americans. The argument had worked before because it transformed criticism of her conduct into an attack on an entire community, forcing opponents to defend their motives, instead of examining her record. Trump refused the frame and said ICE was not in Minneapolis because of him, but because $250 million had been stolen through a program connected to her legislation. He then asked the question that stripped away the shield whether the Somali community was being targeted by the person asking where the money went, or by the politician whose law allowed it to disappear. That question cut deeper than an insult because it placed Omar's identity and her performance in direct conflict, demanding that the community judge results rather than slogans. The people seated behind her did not erupt, boo, or rush to defend her, and their silence carried more weight than any partisan reaction could have produced. A man wearing a kufi removed his stand with Ilhan button and turned it over in his hand, not as a theatrical rejection but as the private gesture of someone reconsidering loyalty. Trump had not converted the room ideologically, but he had forced the audience to examine whether political protection had become a substitute for accountability. That distinction mattered because supporters can survive disagreement, but they begin to fracture when they suspect their loyalty has been used to shield transactions they were never told about. Omar had entered the room as the unquestioned representative of a community, yet the numbers were now separating the community from the person who claimed to speak for it. Trump moved from public money to personal money, shifting the hearing from legislative oversight to federal disclosures and the financial condition of Omar's household. He held up 3 pages and described a transformation so extreme that even Washington's most practiced defenders could not make it sound ordinary. In 2023, her husband's reported business assets were approximately $51,000, a modest figure consistent with a small consulting operation and nothing that would attract serious attention. In 2024, the figure on the same disclosure line reportedly jumped to a range between $6 million and $30 million, an increase too large to dismiss as routine growth. Trump mocked the leap as alchemy, but the force of the point came from the paperwork, because a federal disclosure does not become less binding simply because the number is embarrassing. The next amendment made the situation worse rather than better, because the same assets were later listed at approximately $95,000, and the difference was described as an accounting error. Trump noted that a $29.9 million discrepancy was not the kind of error produced by a misplaced decimal or an overlooked receipt. It was an entirely different answer to the same question submitted on forums that carried legal obligations and consequences. Omar pressed her hand against the edge of the table, the restrained physical reaction of someone trying to remain motionless while the room moved against her. The audience was no longer evaluating a political accusation. It was comparing three federal filings and recognizing that at least two versions could not simultaneously be true. Trump then turned to Rose Lake Capital, the company connected to Tim Minett, and focused on its claim of managing $60 billion in assets. A firm controlling that amount would belong among major financial institutions, would attract extensive regulatory attention, and would normally possess an infrastructure visible far beyond a rented desk. Yet the company was not presented as a major Wall Street operation with offices, analysts, compliance departments, and an established public footprint. Trump said it operated from a WeWork address, reducing the grand claim to the image of a company boasting tens of billions while renting space by the hour. The room laughed because the contrast was absurd, but beneath the laughter sat the obvious regulatory question of how such a claim could exist without immediate scrutiny. The hearing then reached the $2.78 million Omar's campaign had paid to E Street Group between 2019 and 2020, money collected from donors who believed they were funding her political movement. E Street Group belonged to Tim Minett, the consultant Omar was dating before marrying him, which transformed a campaign expense into a personal conflict impossible to explain through generic language about political services. Trump emphasized that the money did not come from Omar's private account but from supporters sending small amounts because they trusted her to represent them. He invoked Amira, a prep cook earning $26,000 a year and donating $50 a month, forcing the room to see the sacrifice hidden behind every line of campaign finance data. When Omar finally said that payments to political consultants were standard, Trump answered without laughter. Standard practice doesn't include marrying the consultant. And the defense collapsed under 9 words. Omar's mouth closed, not because she had accepted Trump's argument, but because any response now risked extending the exact conflict she needed to escape. Her eyes shifted toward her attorney, who continued writing with the concentration of a man who understood that eye contact could become its own televised admission. The consultant defense had sounded acceptable in the abstract, yet the marriage made the arrangement personal, and personal arrangements funded by donors are harder to bury beneath industry language. Trump did not repeat the line because he did not need to. The room had heard it clearly. And repetition would only weaken a sentence already sharp enough to stand alone. He simply straightened in his chair, let the silence settle, and prepared to move from embarrassing disclosures to something far more dangerous. His voice dropped, the grin faded, and the hearing suddenly stopped feeling like a televised argument between two political enemies. Trump said everything discussed so far was public record available on federal forms, court filings, campaign disclosures, and documents anyone could examine without trusting his interpretation. The $250 million, Safari Restaurant, the changing asset figures, Rose Lake Capital, and the $2.78 million were not rumors produced by an anonymous account. They were figures already sitting inside government systems waiting for someone powerful enough, reckless enough, or shameless enough to place them together on live television. The spectacle had brought the audience into the room, but the documents were now doing the work that spectacle alone could never accomplish. Then Trump said the public material was not the most important part because behind closed doors the federal investigation had expanded beyond the original prosecutions. He described new subpoenas, new targets, and new documents connected to the Feeding Our Future network, making clear that the first wave of indictments was not the conclusion. That announcement removed Omar's easiest escape because she could no longer dismiss the matter as a completed scandal involving people outside her office. An expanded investigation meant federal authorities believed additional money, additional actors, or additional transactions remained unresolved, and unresolved federal transactions rarely become less serious with time. The audience leaned forward because the hearing was no longer reviewing an old disaster. It was exposing an active process still moving through the institutions of government. Trump said investigators were following the money after it left Minnesota, focusing not only on where the funds originated but where they traveled afterward. He confirmed that the Treasury Department was tracing transfers connected to entities within the network, including money sent to accounts outside the United States. He refused to identify the country, claiming the investigation remained active, but added that Omar knew which country he meant and that the public would know soon. The sentence was calculated because it offered no destination the press could immediately verify. Yet it placed Omar inside a circle of implied knowledge she could not easily deny. Her body became completely still, and for several seconds every camera captured a woman who had spent the night responding instantly, suddenly choosing not to move. The press gallery reacted before the supporters did because reporters understood the institutional significance of what the president had just confirmed. Phones appeared beneath the tables, messages moved toward editors and producers, and prepared stories were abandoned as the hearing changed category in real time. An argument about bankruptcies and political hypocrisy had become an on-camera disclosure about expanded DOJ activity and Treasury tracing linked to a major fraud network. The story could no longer be contained inside partisan commentary because financial investigators, federal prosecutors, compliance attorneys, and congressional staff would all read those words differently. Trump had not merely won a televised exchange. He had inserted active federal machinery into a confrontation Omar had expected to control through rhetoric. He continued by saying the IRS was reviewing the tax and business filings connected to Rose Lake Capital, the company claiming billions in managed assets from a WeWork address. That detail drew another short laugh, but the laughter was nervous now, because the IRS is not a punchline when federal disclosures contain wildly inconsistent valuations. A company could exaggerate its stature on a website, but once those claims collided with official forms, tax filings, and the spouse of a member of Congress, the exaggeration became harder to treat as harmless marketing. Trump presented the review as an inevitable reaction to figures too large, too unstable, and too contradictory to ignore. The company had survived obscurity, but obscurity ended the moment its numbers were read aloud before 10 million people. Then came the grand jury subpoenas, the phrase that stripped the final layer of political theater from the room. Trump said records had been demanded from Tim Mynette's businesses, including E Street Group, EST Crew, and Rose Lake Capital, placing the entities inside a formal investigative process. Grand jury activity did not prove guilt, but it proved that prosecutors were no longer satisfied with press releases, amended disclosures, or public explanations. They wanted documents, communications, financial records, and the kind of material that cannot be rewritten once it has been produced under legal compulsion. Trump smiled briefly after announcing the subpoenas, not because the matter was funny, but because he understood that Omar's opening insult had now become almost irrelevant. The chairman offered Omar an opportunity to respond, and she stood because silence would have looked like surrender, even though speaking offered no clean path out. She accused the administration of political targeting, weaponizing the Justice Department, and using the Somali community as collateral in a campaign against her. The language was familiar, disciplined, and delivered with the controlled anger of someone who had survived harsher personal attacks than anything spoken in that hearing room. Yet the defense addressed motive rather than substance. focusing on why Trump wanted the investigation while avoiding the figures and transactions that made the investigation possible. In another hearing, that strategy might have worked. But this room was now carrying too many numbers for a motive argument to erase them. No answer explained how $250 million disappeared from a program designed to feed children, or why Safari Restaurant had been praised for meals prosecutors said never existed. No answer reconciled $51,000 with as much as $30 million and then approximately $95,000 on the same financial disclosures. No answer explained the credibility of a $60 billion claim tied to a rented workspace or why millions in campaign funds flowed to a consultant Omar later married. No answer addressed the expanded investigation, the overseas tracing, the IRS review, or the subpoenas directed at her husband's businesses. Omar's words landed cleanly, but they landed on concrete, unable to take root, because every accusation of prejudice now collided with a document Trump had already placed before the cameras. Trump did not interrupt, grin, or offer another line for social media because the hearing had reached the point where another attack would have looked unnecessary. He leaned back, watched the gallery, and allowed Omar's defense to exhaust itself against evidence she had not directly confronted. The supporters who had celebrated her opening remained silent, not because they trusted Trump, but because distrust of Trump did not answer the questions now hanging over her. A button that had read "Stand with Ilhan" sat unclaimed on an empty chair, a small object carrying the weight of a loyalty no longer worn with certainty. Omar had begun the evening demanding that America send back the man who wasted its money. But by the end of the hearing, the only thing Trump had sent back was the receipt. Outside the hearing room, Omar's communications director stared at the statement his team had prepared before the cameras ever turned on. It described a congresswoman confronting the president over racism, immigration, and the political weaponization of fear, because that was the confrontation they had expected and the victory they had planned to sell. The statement was useless now because the hearing had not remained centered on Trump's record, his language, or his treatment of Omar. It had moved relentlessly toward her legislation, her financial disclosures, her campaign payments, her husband's companies, and the federal investigations now surrounding those entities. He deleted the prepared language, opened a new document, typed the representative, and stopped because no communication strategy could transform subpoenas and financial tracing into a triumphant press release. Two clips dominated the aftermath, and the first began exactly where Omar believed she had won. It showed her calling Trump a six-time bankrupt, suggesting that America send him back, and receiving the roar of a gallery convinced it had just witnessed political humiliation. Then came Trump's laughter, real enough to collapse the seriousness of the insult, followed by his pivot from her count of his bankruptcies to his count of her numbers. The clip reached tens of millions of views because the laugh changed the hierarchy of the exchange, making Omar appear less like the aggressor and more like the person who had unknowingly delivered the opening line for Trump's response. Her insult survived online, but it survived as part of his setup, which was precisely the opposite of what her team had intended. The second clip carried no comedy because it contained the announcement of expanded federal action, Treasury tracing, IRS review, and grand jury subpoenas. It circulated through legal circles, compliance forums, investigative communities, and financial networks that normally ignored the theatrical shouting of congressional hearings. Those audiences understood that a president discussing active investigations on camera was not merely producing a campaign slogan, especially when he identified agencies, entities, and investigative tools. Once those statements entered the public record, every denial would be judged against future court filings, agency confirmations, and documents produced under subpoena. Omar could call the hearing political theater, but theater does not explain why federal institutions were already moving through the businesses and transactions Trump had named. During the first week, Omar's office released a statement accusing the administration of disguising political prosecution as legitimate oversight. The statement attacked motive, language, and targeting. but it did not directly answer the $250 million Safari restaurant, the changing asset disclosures, the payments to E Street Group, or the expanding investigation. That omission was not accidental because every available answer carried a new risk, and the safest public response was therefore the one that addressed almost none of the substance. Yet avoiding the substance only sharpened the impression that the numbers were harder to challenge than the man presenting them. In federal defense language, an argument about why investigators are asking questions often becomes an unintentional admission that the questions themselves cannot be answered cleanly. The reaction inside Minneapolis was more dangerous for Omar than any speech from Trump because it came from people she had long claimed as her political foundation. Somali-American business owners and community leaders called for transparency regarding the distribution and oversight of funds connected to the Meals Act. They did not denounce her, endorse Trump, or surrender their political identity because they did not need to do any of those things to create pressure. They simply asked her to cooperate, and that request carried moral force precisely because it came from the community invoked whenever her conduct faced scrutiny. A subpoena can compel documents, but a demand for answers from one's own supporters can destroy the loyalty that makes political survival possible. 6 days after the hearing, the Department of Justice confirmed that the Feeding Our Future investigation had expanded. The confirmation was restrained, procedural, and stripped of Trump's showmanship. But that restraint made it more damaging because institutions do not need applause to exercise power. The department referred to additional financial instruments and cross-border transactions, validating the central direction of the announcement without revealing targets or compromising active work. Trump had made the expansion theatrical, but the government's confirmation made it institutional, and institutional language is far harder to dismiss as a personal feud. Omar's team could attack the president's delivery, yet the machinery continued moving after the cameras left, which exposed the limits of treating every investigation as performance. The IRS also opened a preliminary review involving Rose Lake Capital's filings and business claims, including the extraordinary asset figures associated with the company. The issue was not merely that the firm presented itself as managing $60 billion while operating from a WeWork address, though the contrast invited ridicule on its own. The larger problem was that the company's public claims, federal disclosures, and revised valuations appeared to describe entirely different financial realities. Bureaucratic systems often ignore contradictions until attention becomes unavoidable, and 10 million viewers made avoidance far more difficult than it had been before the hearing. Trump had not created the discrepancies by reading them aloud, but by reading them aloud he ensured that every agency capable of examining them would now be judged for failing to act. By the third week, Tim Mynette's attorney confirmed receipt of subpoenas connected to E Street Group, EST Crew, and Rose Lake Capital. The statement said Mynette would cooperate with lawful requests, language chosen carefully, because denying the existence of the investigation was no longer an available option. There was no declaration that the subpoenas were imaginary, no claim that the companies had never handled the transactions, and no attempt to pretend prosecutors lacked authority. Cooperation did not establish guilt, but it established that the legal process was real, active, and serious enough to require counsel. The hearing had therefore moved beyond viral confrontation and into the slower territory where documents, records, transfers, and sworn explanations replace applause as the only currency that matters. Omar's campaign raised approximately $3.1 million in 2 weeks, proving once again that controversy can produce money even while it produces doubt. Yet the geography of the donations shifted, with more support arriving from New York, California, and Massachusetts, and less enthusiasm coming from Minnesota. That change mattered because distant donors respond to national symbolism, while district voters respond to schools, businesses, taxes, investigations, and whether their representative answers direct questions. Money from outside the district can protect a political brand, but it cannot fully repair weakening trust among the people who must continue living with the consequences. The fundraising spike looked like strength on a spreadsheet, yet beneath it sat the more troubling possibility that Omar's national identity was becoming stronger precisely as her local foundation became less certain. In Cedar Riverside, Amira watched the hearing clip during a break from her work at a Somali restaurant and replayed the moment Trump said her name. He had used her $50 monthly donation and $26,000 annual income to show the sacrifice hidden behind Omar's campaign payments to the company owned by the man she later married. Amira did not cancel the donation that month, issue a statement, or become part of a political campaign against Omar because the damage was quieter than that. For the first time in 6 years, she considered whether the money she gave without hesitation had been treated with the loyalty she believed she was purchasing. Omar had opened the hearing by telling America to send back the man who wasted its money. But Trump ended it by sending back the receipt, and every number on that receipt now belonged to investigators, donors, and a community that had finally begun to ask where its trust had gone.